Imagine a place where the wind never stops, where volcanic rock meets ocean in a geometry designed by violence, where the British Empire, at the height of its power, built something they called the extremest punishment short of death. Norfolk Island, 1,700 miles from Sydney, 14 square miles of green land and black stone. And between 1825 and 1855, it became the place they sent men who had already been sent to hell. Here's the number that should stop you cold: 136,440 lashes, documented, recorded in ledgers that still exist in London archives. That's not cruelty. That's industrial-scale punishment. Violence as a spreadsheet. Suffering quantified like production output. 13 men hanged after the 1834 uprising. Their graves still mark the cemetery. 12 more executed after the cooking pot riot of 1846, buried in an unmarked sawpit they called Murderer's Mound. This is not a story about a prison. This is a story about what happens when you give an empire permission to design punishment without limits. When you build a machine meant to break human beings and then discover the machine works exactly as planned. Today, we're opening the files on Norfolk Island. The architecture, the flogging records, the mutinies, the men who died there and the system that killed them. We're going room by room through the ruins that still stand at Kingston, and we're asking the question no one wanted to answer. If the only way to run this place was through terror, what does that tell us about what was built? This is the deep dive, the forensic investigation, the story they tried to bury in an unmarked grave. Welcome to the dark history of Norfolk Island. Let's go inside. There's a place in the South Pacific where the wind never stops arguing with the waves, where black volcanic rock meets ocean shelf in a geometry of refusal, where the reef line forms a barrier that has, for centuries, sorted the living from the drowned with the casual precision of a bureaucrat stamping forms. Norfolk Island. 14.3 square miles of basalt and colonial ambition. 1,700 miles from Sydney. 1,000 from New Zealand. Small enough to walk across in an afternoon. Isolated enough that the nearest rescue in most weather is a theory rather than a plan. Stand at the coastal cliffs and you understand immediately. This is not a place that welcomes arrival. The surf doesn't lap. It detonates. Whitewater climbs the rock face, falls back, climbs again, a rhythm without rest or mercy. The wind carries salt spray inland, coating everything, stone, metal, skin, with a fine glaze of corrosion. The weather doesn't pass through Norfolk Island, it occupies it. The Bureau of Meteorology will tell you the numbers. Annual rainfall averaging over 40 inches, wind velocities that strip paint from timber, humidity levels that turn iron into rust and rope into rot. This is data, the cold mathematics of atmosphere and geography. But numbers don't capture the psychic weight of weather that never relents, of wind that makes every structure creak, every door slam, every night sound like something is trying to get in. And here's the thing that makes what follows feel not accidental but designed. Norfolk Island is green, lush even. The rain that batters the buildings also feeds the soil. Pines rise, ferns spread. The island breathes. It's not a desert. It's not a wasteland. It's alive, fertile, capable of sustaining human life quite comfortably. Which means that when you push inland from the coast, when you walk the old pathways toward the settlement at Kingston, when you see the ruins emerging from the vegetation like bones through flesh, you realize that what happened here wasn't forced by scarcity. It was chosen, built, implemented with intention. The ruins aren't just old buildings. They're a machine footprint, the shape of a system. But before we can understand the machine, we need to understand the ground it was built on. Norfolk Island was not empty when the British arrived. That's a convenient fiction, the kind empire tells itself to smooth the paperwork. There were earlier human layers here, Polynesian settlement patterns that archaeologists can trace in the scatter of artifacts, the ghost lines of cultivation, the subtle reshaping of landscape that only long occupation produces. Then the first European contact, Captain Cook in 1774, naming the island after the Duchess of Norfolk, a gesture of imperial property law enacted with words across an ocean. The island noted. Mapped. Claimed by description before possession. The first British settlement came in 1788, part of the broader convict infrastructure spreading across the Pacific. Norfolk was meant to be strategic, a source of flax and timber for the growing colony, a waypoint for ships, a demonstration of British reach. And for a time it functioned. People arrived, structures went up, the land was cleared and planted. But Kingston, the main settlement site, became something more complex than a simple colonial outpost. It became a palimpsest. Layers upon layers. One administration would build on the foundations of another. Stone from earlier structures was cannibalized for new construction. Cleared land was replanted, then cleared again. The same wells were redug. The same paths were widened, formalized, incorporated into successive designs. What this means is that you can't start fresh on Norfolk. Every new project inherits the geography, the limitations, the previous failures. The island has a memory built into its soil. The ground at Kingston is archaeology in active use, settlement periods stacked like pages in a ledger, each one leaving marks that constrain what comes after. And those constraints are not subtle. Norfolk Island is small, the usable land even smaller. The harbor is marginal at best. The reef line makes landing cargo a calculated risk every single time. These are fixed variables, unchangeable. Any administration that tries to operate here must negotiate with the same brutal facts of logistics, weather, and isolation. The first British settlement learned this through experience, through supply failures, through the slow realization that maintaining a distant outpost is expensive in ways that compound over time. Ships arrive late or not at all. Stores spoil. Tools break. Replacement parts have to be ordered from Sydney, which means months of delay. The simplest repair becomes a logistical opera. And then there's the ocean itself. The first hard lesson. 1790. HMS Sirius, flagship of the First Fleet, attempting to deliver supplies to Norfolk. The ship navigates through the reef approaches. These are skilled sailors, experienced officers, a vessel that has crossed the world, and the reef doesn't care. The Sirius strikes. The hull opens. The ocean rushes in with the finality of a closing door. The wreck happens fast, but the consequences unfold slowly. The ship settles in the shallows off Slaughter Bay, the name telling you everything you need to know about the island's relationship with arrivals. Salvage operations begin immediately because on an island this isolated you can't afford to waste anything. Tools, metal, timber, sails, everything that can be pulled from the wreck is pulled. Repurposed, integrated into the settlement's inventory. But the real salvage is the lesson. Norfolk Island is not a place you can control through planning or skill or British naval confidence. The ocean is boss. The reef is judge. Every shipment is a negotiation. Every landing is a gamble. The island demands contingency plans for your contingency plans. And here's what makes the Sirius wreck more than historical footnote. Thousands of artifacts have been recovered from the site over the centuries. Cannons, anchors, personal possessions, the detritus of a ship that was supposed to prove British dominance over distance and ocean. The ocean kept it all, held it, waited. Because on Norfolk, even lost things remain. Nothing truly disappears. The island collects. So when you stand at Kingston and look at the ruins, understand, the reef has seen these stones before. The wind has tested these walls 1,000,000 times. And the question forms itself slowly, like water seeping through mortar. If a flagship of the Royal Navy can be broken here, what chance does a human being have when the island is repurposed as a cage? That question wasn't rhetorical for long. The first settlement period lasted until 1814. By then, the arithmetic of empire had turned against Norfolk. The flax industry never materialized as planned. The timber was useful, but not essential. The strategic value was theoretical. And the cost, the endless cost of maintaining supply lines across 1,700 miles of open ocean, was measurable in pounds sterling and ships and lives and political patience. So the island was evacuated. Buildings abandoned. Cleared land allowed to return to wilderness. The settlement era ended not with drama but with ledgers, a financial decision dressed in operational language. But here's what makes this abandonment critical to everything that follows. The infrastructure didn't vanish. The roads remained, even as grass grew over them. The buildings stood, even as roofs collapsed and doors rotted off hinges. The cleared land stayed cleared, the boundaries legible even under new growth. The wells still held water. The stone foundations still supported weight. Norfolk Island's first failure wasn't erased. It was stored, mothballed, left in place like a factory that might reopen if conditions change. And stored infrastructure has a way of suggesting possibility, of whispering to administrators looking at maps and budgets. The island didn't have to be built from scratch. It was already half-built. The skeleton already stood. All it needed was a new purpose, a new population, a new set of orders, which brings us to July 1824. London, the Home Office, a set of instructions that will convert a failed economic outpost into something far darker. The British Empire by this point has a problem it frames as a policy challenge. The convict system in Australia is producing a category of prisoner that defies the standard mechanisms of control. Men who've been transported once and re-offended. Men who've killed in custody. Men so violent or incorrigible that even the brutal norms of a penal colony can't contain them. The question posed to administrators is this: what do you do with prisoners for whom standard transportation is no longer a threat? Men for whom being sent to New South Wales is just Tuesday. The answer, when it arrives in written orders, is clinical, bureaucratic, and absolutely chilling. Norfolk Island will reopen. Not as a settlement, not as an economic venture, as a secondary punishment facility, a place of such concentrated misery that its reputation alone will serve as deterrence, a terror symbol, a behavioral tool. The very idea of Norfolk Island is meant to haunt the mind of every convict in the Australian colonies. The threat of being sent there, the mere possibility, is supposed to function as social control. This is not rehabilitation. This is weaponized hopelessness. The policy language from the period is revealing in its coldness. Officials describe Norfolk Island as the extremist punishment short of death. The phrasing is deliberate. They're not hiding what this is, they're advertising it. The cruelty is the point. The isolation is the point. The psychological weight of knowing that beyond transportation, beyond the normal mechanisms of colonial justice, there exists a place even darker. That knowledge is supposed to ripple through the entire convict population and modify behavior through dread. It's a form of psychological warfare. The island becomes a story told to prisoners, a warning, a shadow jurisdiction where normal rules don't apply and normal mercy doesn't exist. And unlike most threats, this one is real. The orders are signed. The budget is allocated. The ships are requisitioned. Now they need bodies, they need guards, they need tools and chains and the entire apparatus of carceral infrastructure. They need someone to build the machine and someone to operate it. They need to beat the reef. June 6, 1825. The Reoccupation Manifest. Major Turton returns to Norfolk Island with a company of troops, a handful of women and children, the domestic infrastructure of military occupation, and 57 convicts. This is the seed, the core population from which the penal station will grow. The arrival itself is a masterclass in what Norfolk demands. Ships approach cautiously. The surf conditions have to be read. The landing window has to be calculated. Boats are lowered. Cargo is transferred in stages. Every crate of nails, every barrel of flour, every axe and chain and bolt of cloth has to make the journey from ship to shore without being lost to the ocean. And that inventory matters. On an island this isolated, you can't call for replacements. The axes you arrive with are the axes you have until the next supply ship, which might be weeks or months away. Tools are not conveniences, they're lifelines. Lose your axes, and you can't clear land. Lose your nails, and you can't build shelter. Lose your flour, and you starve. So the first crisis is not violence. It's inventory. It's the grinding awareness that everything must be accounted for, stored properly, protected from salt air and rats and moisture and theft. The settlement becomes an accounting exercise before it becomes anything else. But the population doesn't stay at 57. Within a decade, the convict numbers climb toward 700. 700 men on 14 square miles. 700 men who've been sent to the place that's supposed to be worse than death. The blueprint expands faster than the island can comfortably feed or house. This is the math that will define everything. More prisoners than bunks. More mouths than rations. More rage than the walls can safely contain. The first winter rains roll in. Heavy, persistent, soaking into everything. And the great Hulk, the terror symbol, the machine of deterrence, needs real walls. Walls that will stand in salt wind. Walls that will hold what's being gathered inside them. The construction begins. And with it, the long fall into something that history will struggle to name. 1827. The settlement has walls now, barracks rising from cleared ground, a compound taking shape around Kingston. But walls alone don't make a machine. A machine needs moving parts. It needs mechanisms that convert human effort into institutional output. The crank mill. It arrives as engineering, a timber frame structure built on stone foundations designed to harness convict labor through rotation. Men would push wooden arms mounted to a central shaft. The shaft would turn grinding stones. The stones would process grain. The grain would become flour. The flour would feed the colony. That's the official description, the operational manual. But the crank mill isn't really about flour. The crank mill is about discipline as mechanics, about turning human resistance into physical exhaustion through the elegant simplicity of friction and leverage. You take prisoners deemed too dangerous or unruly. You assign them to the mill, you set quotas, you count rotations, you measure output. And when the body breaks down, which it will, because that's the design, you document the failure and assign someone else. The engineering is specific. The wooden arms have to be thick enough to bear the weight of multiple men pushing. The central shaft has to be mounted on bearings that won't seize despite humidity and constant use. The grinding stones have to be balanced, their surfaces dressed to maintain friction. The whole apparatus has to be enclosed to prevent escape but ventilated enough to prevent men from collapsing from heat. And all of this happens in salt air, in an environment where moisture is constant, where every piece of metal oxidizes, where timber swells and warps. Maintenance is not occasional, it's continuous, which means more labor, more oversight, more opportunities for sabotage disguised as accident. The crank mill operates for 11 years, 1827 to 1838. During that span, thousands of men will push its arms, thousands of rotations will be counted, tons of grain will be processed. But the real product, the actual output, isn't measured in bushels. It's compliance. It's the behavioral modification that comes from knowing that your body is just fuel for a machine that doesn't care if you understand why you're pushing. The absurdity is the point. The pointlessness is the lesson. You push because you're told to push. The mill turns because the mill turns. And when your shift ends, someone else steps in. This is punishment industrialized, suffering as a repeatable process. But machines can break, especially when the operators aren't invested in the outcome, especially when every person on the wooden arms is calculating angles, testing tolerances, learning where the system is weakest. The crank mill is just one piece. The settlement needs housing. Dense housing. Structures that can hold the growing population of long-term prisoners who won't be returned to the mainland, who are, for all practical purposes, permanent inventory. 1828 through 1848, the long-term prisoner barracks rise near the chapel at Kingston. These aren't cottages. They're human batteries. Dense, multi-level structures designed to pack bodies into the smallest footprint possible while maintaining just enough order to prevent complete chaos. The logistics are revealing. Bunks are stacked. Sleeping arrangements are assigned by discipline category, the violent separated from the thieves, the repeat offenders from the first-timers. But separation is relative when you're dealing with rooms full of men who've been stripped of everything except the capacity to hate. Ventilation is a problem. Windows have to provide airflow but can't be large enough to enable escape, which means the air inside becomes thick with breath, sweat, the smell of bodies that haven't bathed, the accumulated humidity of people living on top of each other. The barracks become an atmosphere you can taste, and sound, the acoustic reality of stone walls and wooden floors and dozens of men confined together. Every cough travels, every whisper carries. Sleep is fractured. Privacy doesn't exist. The night watch patterns mean guards are moving through corridors at irregular intervals, checking counts, listening for conspiracy. This is where the island starts manufacturing its own enemy, because when you lock intelligent, angry men in close quarters for years, they learn. They read the routines. They count the number of keys each guard carries. They notice which hinges squeak, which doors don't latch properly, which sight lines are blocked. The barracks become a school for resistance, and the curriculum is observation. The population swells. 700 becomes the norm, which means the system needs punishment that can scale, that can be applied efficiently, repeatedly, without requiring elaborate infrastructure or individual attention. Enter the cat-o'-nine tails. If the crank mill is discipline as mechanics, then flogging is discipline as mathematics. Violence reduced to spreadsheet logic. The cat-o'-nine tails, the whip that will define Norfolk Island in the historical record, is not random cruelty. It's scheduled technology, a bureaucratic procedure with forms to fill out, approvals to secure, protocols to follow. First, the charge. A prisoner is accused of infractions ranging from theft to insubordination to conspiracy to simple defiance. The charge is recorded, investigated, at least nominally. Then the sentence is handed down. 50 lashes, 100, 200. The numbers vary based on the severity of the offense and the mood of the administration, but the execution of punishment is standardized. The prisoner is restrained, usually tied to a wooden frame designed to expose the back while preventing movement. The flogger, often another convict incentivized with marginal privileges, delivers the sentence in counted strokes. Officers observe to ensure the count is accurate. A medical officer may be present to determine if the prisoner can survive the full sentence or if it needs to be split across multiple sessions. The cat-o'-nine tails itself is exactly what the name suggests. 9 cords, often weighted or knotted, attached to a handle. Each stroke delivers 9 separate impacts. The flesh opens. Scarring builds over repeated punishments. Some men carry maps of their incarceration on their backs, raised tissue that tells the story of every time they tested the system and the system responded. The record is staggering: 136,440 lashes, documented. Across the years 1829 and 1833 through 1853. This is not rumor, it's archival data. Pain quantified like production output. University College London holds the records. The flogging registers. Line after line of names, offenses, sentences. The ledger is neat, the handwriting careful. The administrative calm with which mass violence is recorded is, in some ways, more disturbing than the violence itself, because this tells you what Norfolk Island actually is. It's not chaos. It's not madness. It's a system, a functioning, deliberate, meticulously documented system that has determined that industrial-scale corporal punishment is an acceptable operational cost. And here's the thing about making pain the currency. Inflation is inevitable. When 100 lashes doesn't deter, you escalate to 200. When 200 doesn't work, you create new categories of punishment. The baseline keeps rising because the population adapts. Men learn to endure, which means the system has to find new ways to break them. The colony is learning the hard truth that every authoritarian structure eventually confronts. Once fear is your only tool, you need more fear than you can safely generate. But fear needs a stage. It needs architecture that makes power visible. 1829. Government House rises on elevated ground overlooking Kingston. This is not an accident of construction. This is doctrine in stone. Power must be seen. Authority must occupy the commanding view. Government House is where the commandant lives, where decisions are made, where the paperwork that sentences men to flogging is signed. The building is designed to look down on the compound, the barracks, the workshops. Every prisoner moving through Kingston does so under the gaze of the structure that represents control. The symbolism is blunt. The officials are elevated. The prisoners are below. The geography reinforces hierarchy. But symbolism alone doesn't hold a settlement. You need operational infrastructure, security architecture that makes escape difficult and revolt costly. 1829 through 1834. The old military barracks and officers' quarters go up, compound walls, guard rooms, a powder magazine, because if you're storing gunpowder on a prison island, it needs to be in a structure that won't detonate the entire settlement if something goes wrong. Wells are dug, water is secured. The compound becomes a fortress within the settlement, a keep within the larger machine. Every design choice is about intimidation made visible. Walls are higher than they need to be. Gates are reinforced beyond practical necessity. The aesthetic is undefeatable. The message to prisoners is clear. This place cannot be taken. Resistance is architectural impossibility. But architecture is stone and mortar, and stone can't out-engineer despair. January 1834. The Mutiny. It starts the way these things always start, with accumulated pressure finding a weak point, a confluence of grievances, a moment when enough men simultaneously decide that the future inside the system is worse than the risk of trying to break it. The practical anatomy of revolt on an island is specific. You can't just run. There's nowhere to go. The ocean is a wall. So the uprising has to achieve something else. Take hostages, seize weapons, create leverage for negotiation, or failing that, inflict enough damage on the system that being killed in the attempt feels like victory. Stolen tools become improvised weapons, a hammer, a metal bar, anything with weight and edge. The hunt for keys becomes critical, because keys unlock doors, unlock cells, unlock the armory if you can get to it. The corridors turn into battlegrounds, shouted orders, the scramble for tactical position, guards trying to lock down sections of the compound while prisoners try to overwhelm through numbers. The island's reputation feeds the violence. When hope is outlawed, when the system has made it clear that compliance leads nowhere except more years of the same, the future becomes disposable. Men fight with the energy of people who've done the math and realized they have nothing left to preserve. The uprising is contained. Military discipline and firepower eventually restore order. But the process is ugly. Blood on stone floors. Bodies carried out. The wounded treated. The dead inventoried. Order returns. But the response is not reflection. It's not policy review. It's not a moment where the administration asks whether a system that produces spontaneous violence might need adjustment. The response is spectacle. After an uprising, institutions have choices. They can investigate root causes. They can reform conditions. They can demonstrate that the social contract, however strained, still contains room for mercy. Norfolk Island chooses none of these. 13 prisoners are selected. The selection process is part investigation, part political theater. Some are clearly leaders of the revolt. Others are symbolic choices. Men whose execution will send specific messages to specific populations within the prison. Trials are conducted. Sentences are handed down. And then the machinery of state execution moves forward with the procedural calm that characterizes all of Norfolk's violence. Gallows are erected, not hidden, not done in darkness, public, visible. The execution is operational theater, a demonstration of what happens when you test the system's limits. 13 men hang. Some of their headstones remain at Kingston Cemetery, markers in stone that do more than commemorate. They warn, they testify. They serve as part of the security system, a visible ledger of consequences, because the cemetery at Norfolk Island isn't just where the dead are buried, it's where the living are taught. Every prisoner walking past those markers is meant to understand. The colony doesn't just punish, it remembers. It documents. It inscribes lessons in granite so they can't be forgotten or revised. The island doesn't just punish the guilty. It broadcasts the message to everyone still breathing. Fear is only effective if it's communicated. Violence is only deterrent if it's witnessed. And Norfolk Island, by 1834, has become expert at converting death into pedagogy. A new commandant arrives, and his response to blood is not conscience, it's construction. Because after violence, institutions often choose to build new structures, new walls, more infrastructure, as if adding stone to stone can somehow contain what's been unleashed. The machine expands, the fortress thickens, and the question that no one in authority seems willing to ask out loud: if we keep adding walls and still can't hold what's inside, what does that tell us about what we've built? The answer is already forming in the humid air, in the sound of waves against reef, in the silence of 13 graves that refuse to be quiet. 1835 through 1837, the response to mutiny is expansion. New military barracks, a bigger compound, surviving walls that will stand for over a century, testifying to the scale of what was built here. The construction is massive, limestone blocks quarried and hauled, mortar mixed with sand that carries salt from the ocean air, which means it never quite cures properly, which means maintenance starts the moment construction ends. Archways are built to support upper floors. Turrets rise at corners, not decorative, functional. Positions from which guards can observe the yard, the approaches, the perimeter. The cost of this construction isn't measured only in pounds sterling shipped from London. It's measured in labor hours stolen from bodies already depleted. Mortar mixed under threat. Stone hauled in rain by men who know that if they slow down, if they stop, the cat o' nine tails is waiting. Every brick laid is a transaction where one man's exhaustion buys the empire another square foot of control. And the mathematics of fortress expansion are cruel. More walls mean more perimeter to patrol, more roofs to repair when the salt wind strips shingles and corrodes flashing, more doors, more locks, more keys to track, more windows to bar, more corners where rebellion might gather out of sight. The fortress grows, but so does the maintenance burden. Norfolk Island, with its relentless humidity and corrosive ocean air, doesn't let structures rest. Paint peels within months, metal oxidizes, timber rots from the inside out. The compound requires constant attention, constant repair, constant vigilance against entropy. It's a treadmill. The bigger the fortress, the more labor required to maintain it. The more labor required, the more prisoners needed. The more prisoners gathered, the larger the fortress must grow to contain them. The system is consuming itself in slow motion, building walls to hold the men required to maintain the walls. But the real problem, the problem that all the stone and mortar in the empire can't solve, isn't inland. It's at the edge, at the shoreline, at the exact point where land meets ocean and every supply shipment has to negotiate passage. 1839 through 1847, the settlement invests in taming the edge. A landing pier is constructed. A seawall is raised. Engineering meant to convert the chaotic violence of surf and reef into something predictable, something manageable. The ambition is understandable. Every shipment that arrives at Norfolk has to run a gauntlet. Ships anchor offshore. Boats are lowered. Cargo is transferred in windows of opportunity measured in minutes. Swell conditions determine everything. Too much wave action, and the boats can't approach safely. Too little, and they can't get back out through the reef. Timing determines survival. A ship arrives with flour, salt, tools, medicine, everything the settlement needs to function. But if the weather turns before unloading is complete, those supplies stay on the ship. And the ship, if it's smart, retreats to deeper water to wait for the next window, which might be tomorrow, might be next week. Or the ship might try to force the landing, might gamble that the crew can work fast enough to beat the weather. And sometimes that gamble works. Sometimes it doesn't. One bad landing can starve a camp. One rope failure can drop a month's worth of provisions into the ocean. One miscalculation of swell period can smash a boat against rock and kill everyone aboard. The pier is meant to reduce those variables. solid footing, a structure that projects out past the worst of the surf line, bollards to secure ropes, a platform high enough to keep cargo above water during moderate swells. But the ocean remains the real warden. You can build a wall, you can construct a pier, you can map the reef and chart the safe approaches, but you cannot build certainty. The ocean is not negotiating, it's measuring, and occasionally it reminds everyone who thinks they've solved the problem that the problem was never solvable. The seawall stands, the pier extends, ships still arrive, supplies still come through usually. The settlement survives, but every person who spent time watching the surf knows the ocean is being patient. It's allowing this, and allowance can be withdrawn at any moment. Into this unstable machine, this fortress built on hope and fear and brutal logistics, walks a man with a dangerous idea. The idea that maybe, possibly, the system could be something other than pure punishment. 1840 through 1844, Captain Alexander Maconochie takes command. And he brings with him a concept that's almost contraband in a place like Norfolk: hope. Maconochie's reform isn't naive. He understands he's inheriting a machine designed for one purpose: to break men. But he believes the machine can be recalibrated, that you can introduce incentives, graduations, a system where behavior is rewarded with marginal increases in freedom or comfort. The Marx system. Prisoners earn credits for labor, for compliance, for time served. Credits accumulate. Eventually, credits can be exchanged for small privileges, better rations, less supervision. The possibility, distant but real, of parole, of return to the mainland, of a future that isn't just Norfolk Island forever. He separates populations, creates classifications. Some prisoners are moved to outstations, smaller camps away from Kingston where the density of surveillance is lower, where the work is agricultural rather than punitive. Geography is used as a behavioral tool. You behave, you move to a place where life is marginally less terrible. This is revolutionary in context, because Norfolk Island's entire operational logic has been, there is no hope here. That's the design. That's the deterrent. And Maconochie is suggesting that maybe deterrence isn't the only option, that maybe you can use gradations of suffering rather than maximum suffering constantly. The reforms show results, at least initially. Some prisoners respond to incentives. Violence decreases in certain sectors. The outstations function without major incident. For a brief period, it looks like Norfolk might transform from hell to merely purgatory, from a place where death is preferable to a place where endurance has purpose. But reform requires authority, and authority on Norfolk Island is fragile. Because everyone, guards, prisoners, administrators back in Sydney, expects brutality. The entire system has been sold as brutality. Stakeholders have invested in brutality. Reputations have been built on Norfolk being the worst. When you try to retrofit humanity into a system designed for dread, something has to break. Usually people. The system resists from within. Guards who've operated under the old regime don't trust the new incentives. They see Maconochie's reforms as weakness, as dangerous compromise. Some prisoners respond to hope. Others see it as manipulation and resist harder than before. And then there's Sydney, the authorities back on the mainland who are watching Maconochie's experiment with skepticism. Because if Norfolk stops being terrible, if it stops being the ultimate threat, then what's deterring the entire convict population from testing boundaries? Maconochie's control begins to slip. And when reformers lose leverage, when the political support erodes, institutions reach for the oldest tool in the kit. 1842 through 1843. The flogging numbers increase. Even during Maconochie's tenure, even while he's trying to implement reform, the cat-o'-nine-tails is still being used. Extensively. This is the engineer's tragedy. You can't retrofit humanity into a system designed for dread without breaking something. And what breaks is usually the reform itself. The baseline gravity of Norfolk Island is violence. That's the foundation. That's the load-bearing structure. Everything else is cosmetic. Maconochie tries to balance reform with order, incentives with punishment, hope with fear. But the balance is impossible, because the system was never designed for balance. It was designed for one output: deterrence through suffering. When you try to make it produce something else, the machinery jams, and the reports flowing back to Sydney tell a story that authorities want to hear. Makinoki is losing control. Discipline is eroding. The experiment is failing. Norfolk Island is becoming too soft, and soft is dangerous when you're trying to manage a convict empire. By 1843, criticism hardens, official recommendations are drafted, political consensus forms around a simple conclusion: the reform experiment needs to end. Norfolk Island needs to return to its original purpose: pure punishment, unambiguous, uncomplicated by notions of rehabilitation or hope. The island prepares to swap experiment for certainty. 1844 through 1846. Major Joseph Childs takes command. The machine returns to its original settings. Childs represents a specific philosophy: order through fear, compliance through consequence, control through the visible demonstration that mercy is a resource the colony does not possess. He dismantles Makinoki's mark system. The outstations are reduced or closed. Prisoners are consolidated back into the main compound, where surveillance is total and escape is geometry rather than ambition. Infrastructure keeps growing during this period. A blacksmith shop is constructed in 1846. Industrial yards expand. Because even though the philosophical approach has reverted, the practical needs haven't changed. The settlement still requires tool production, metalwork, repair capacity. But here's the paradox that sharpens under Childs: more tools mean more productivity. The island can manufacture more of what it needs, reduce dependence on irregular supply ships, build self-sufficiency. More tools also mean more potential weapons. Every hammer is a hammer until someone decides it's a skull crusher. Every metal bar is structural support until it's pried loose and becomes a pry bar aimed at a lock or a guard. The colony exists in permanent tension between needing prisoner labor to function and fearing what prisoners might do with the tools required for that labor. Every axe issued is a calculated risk. Every knife distributed for kitchen work is potential homicide. The system requires trust it cannot afford to give. Childs tries to manage this through discipline, rigid counts, tool inventories conducted multiple times per shift, inspections, searches, the ratcheting up of surveillance to compensate for the fact that the island is, functionally, arming the people it's trying to suppress. And then a small policy decision, seemingly minor, administratively defensible, touches the one nerve you never touch in a starvation economy. July 1st, 1846. Cooking vessels are confiscated. The reasoning is operational. The administration argues that prisoners have been using individual cooking vessels to prepare extra food, to trade rations, to create informal economies that undermine official control. The vessels are contraband. Removing them is standard security procedure. But on an island where food is currency, where hunger is baseline, where the difference between a marginally better meal and the standard slop is one of the few things prisoners can control, you don't take cooking pots without understanding what you're actually taking. You're taking the last shred of autonomy, the final margin of dignity. The convicts erupt. The uprising doesn't build slowly. There's no conspiracy, no careful planning, no manifesto. It's instant, rage converting directly into violence. The cooking vessel confiscation is the spark, but the fuel has been accumulating for decades. Every flogging, every humiliation, every year of grinding brutality compressed into a flashpoint. Axes. That's what they grab. The tool yard becomes an armory in seconds. Men who've been swinging axes to cut timber or quarry stone suddenly redirect that energy toward flesh and bone. 4 officials are targeted: overseers, guards, representatives of the system that just took their cooking pots. The attacks are brutal, intimate, not executions from a distance. Close work, blood on hands, the kind of violence that happens when fury meets proximity. The yard descends into chaos. Shouted orders, men running, guards trying to form defensive positions while also trying to understand what's happening. Prisoners who aren't part of the initial violence now have to choose: Join the uprising, stay neutral, or actively help restore order. Military response is immediate. Troops deploy. Firearms are issued. The compound is locked down section by section. Prisoners are searched, not gently, for weapons, for blood evidence, for any sign of participation. The system becomes a crime scene conveyor belt. Process every body. Document every injury. Build the case that will justify what comes next. 4 officials dead, dozens wounded. The uprising is suppressed not through negotiation or de-escalation, but through superior force. Guns beat axes, training beats rage. Order returns, but order in this case means prisoners subdued, locked down, awaiting judgment. The island doesn't calm down after violence like this. It waits, because everyone knows what's coming. Everyone knows that an uprising that kills officials cannot be answered with anything less than maximum response. Trials will be conducted, but the outcome is already determined. The gallows will be erected. The message will be sent. And Norfolk Island will once again demonstrate that the only future available to prisoners who test the system is death, public and procedural. The waiting is its own form of torture, locked in cells, uncertain who will be selected for execution, knowing that selection might be about actual guilt or might be about sending the right symbolic message to the right population. The trials proceed. Evidence is presented. Testimony taken. Sentences handed down with the mechanical efficiency of an institution that has done this before and will likely do it again. And then the final preparation begins. Gallows measured and built. Execution protocols reviewed. The timetable set. Because Norfolk Island has learned something by 1846, violence doesn't end violence. It just creates the conditions for the next eruption. But the system has no other answer. The only tool in the kit is more of what caused the problem in the first place. The axe blades are collected. The blood is scrubbed from stone. The compound returns to routine. But under the routine, pressure builds again, because the cooking pot uprising answered a question no one wanted to ask. What happens when you corner people completely? You find out that even people with nothing left can still choose violence, can still decide that dying on your feet is preferable to living on your knees. And the island, surrounded by its reef, battered by its endless wind, holds that knowledge in the wet air like a promise. October 1846, 2 batches of 6, 12 men total. An assembly line ending to an assembly line riot. The executions are not hidden. They're not conducted in darkness or behind walls. They're public. Operational theater. The gallows are erected in a location where the entire compound can witness. This is not cruelty for its own sake, though it is cruel. This is state violence staged as pedagogy. Every prisoner is meant to watch. Every prisoner is meant to understand. The mechanics of hanging are specific. The rope, the knot, the drop distance calculated based on body weight to ensure a quick death rather than slow strangulation. There's a procedure, a sequence, protocols that have been refined across centuries of institutional execution. Troops are positioned, not just as security, as audience management. The prisoners are assembled in formation where they can see but cannot interfere. Guards watch the prisoners watching the executions, reading faces for signs of sympathy or defiance, or the kind of rage that might ignite into a second uprising. The first 6 hang. The bodies drop. The next break or don't, depending on the precision of the drop calculation. The bodies are left suspended for a period. Display duration matters. Then they're cut down. The second group of 6 is prepared. The process repeats. 12 men, 2 batches. The institutional efficiency is the point. This isn't passion. This isn't revenge exactly. It's demonstration. The colony showing that it can process resistance the same way it processes grain through the crank mill. Systematically, repeatedly, without emotion. But here's where Norfolk's brutality acquires an extra layer of darkness. The bodies aren't buried in the main cemetery. They're taken to an old saw pit outside the consecrated ground. Unmarked. Unconsecrated. Dumped in earth that's already disturbed, already carrying the chemical signature of industrial work. The location will later be called Murderer's Mound. Not officially. That's not the kind of name that appears on maps produced by the colonial administration. But that's what people call it. The prisoners, the guards, anyone who knows the story, because even burial becomes punishment on Norfolk Island. Even death doesn't grant you the dignity of a marked grave. The cemetery at Kingston, with its neat rows, its headstones, its maintained paths, that's for people who died within acceptable parameters. Murderer's Mound is for people who died as warnings, and the mound remains. Archaeologists would later confirm human remains in that location. The ground keeps what was buried there. The island collects, remembers, refuses to let go. The question hits the mainland like weather. Reports flow back to Sydney, then to London. The cooking pot uprising. 4 officials killed. 12 prisoners executed. And underneath the specific details of that specific incident, a larger question forms. If the only way to run Norfolk Island is this, if order requires mass flogging and public execution and the conversion of human beings into examples, can the experiment continue? Because that's what Norfolk Island is by 1846, an experiment. A test of how much brutality a system can deploy in the name of deterrence. And the experiment is returning data that even the architects of the system find disturbing. 1847. The closure order arrives. Britain informs the New South Wales governor the settlement is to be abolished. Norfolk Island, as a penal station, will be shut down. The decision comes from the top. Official policy. The machine will be dismantled. But shutting down a prison isn't turning off a lamp. It's logistics. It's manifests and transfers and ships and scheduling. Every prisoner becomes cargo again. Every guard needs reassignment. Every piece of equipment has to be inventoried. What ships back to Sydney? What stays? What can be sold or scrapped? The buildings can't be moved. The stone walls stay. The barracks remain standing. But everything inside, the beds, the chains, the administrative records, the tools, has to be categorized and processed. Sir William Denison, the governor, reviews the operational reports and formally recommends closure. This is significant. The colony is being condemned by its own creators. The system that designed Norfolk as the ultimate deterrent is now admitting that the cost, financial, political, moral, exceeds the value. But closure doesn't happen overnight. The machinery of empire moves slowly. Orders are issued in 1847. Full evacuation won't happen until 1855. That's 8 years. 8 years where Norfolk Island enters its creepiest phase. Still operating, still confining prisoners, still conducting floggings and enforcing discipline, but spiritually already dead. A condemned institution continuing to function because inertia is stronger than intent. 1847 through 1853. The wind down. The population reduces gradually as prisoners are transferred out in batches. The supply ships come less frequently. The budget shrinks. The settlement operates in a lower gear. Same routines, fewer bodies, more silence. Buildings rot faster than they can be repaired. Salt wind is relentless. Roofs leak. Walls develop cracks. Moisture infiltrates foundations. The maintenance crews that once kept up with entropy are being transferred or released. What remains is triage. Patch the worst leaks. Shore up walls that are actually collapsing. Keep the stores dry enough to prevent total loss. Let everything else degrade. The fortress that was built to project permanence reveals its actual nature. Temporary, provisional, held together by constant labor. And when that labor is withdrawn, the ocean air goes to work. But even as the settlement winds down, even as closure is decided, the flogging numbers tell a different story. The records from this period, preserved at University College London, show that the colony never softened as a system. The cat-o'-nine tails remained in active use. Sentences were still being handed down. Flesh was still being opened according to schedule. This is critical, because it would be comforting to imagine that once closure was decided, the brutality eased, that the system showed mercy in its final years. But Norfolk Island doesn't do mercy. Even in decline, even knowing the end is coming, the machine continues to process prisoners through punishment with the same bureaucratic precision it always did. The ledger keeps filling. The scars keep accumulating. Men who will be transferred to mainland prisons carry Norfolk Island on their backs, in raised tissue, in the map of their suffering, in the physical evidence that some places leave marks that never fade. 1853 brings another shift, not specific to Norfolk but empire-wide. Transportation policies change. The entire British convict system is being reconsidered. Australia's colonies are pushing back against being used as dumping grounds for England's criminal population. Political pressure mounts. Economic calculations shift. Norfolk Island's remaining purpose collapses. It's not just that the island failed, it's that the entire model, the secondary punishment station, the terror symbol, the geographic isolation as behavioral tool, is being retired. The question now is just timing. How long until the last prisoner leaves? How long until the settlement can be officially closed and the island handed over to whatever comes next? October 1854. A count is taken. 119 convicts remain. 119 men on an island built to hold 700. The barracks that used to overflow with bodies now echo. The workshops operate at minimal capacity. The compound that was designed to feel oppressive through density now feels oppressive through emptiness. Security becomes uncanny. Too few prisoners to justify the fortress. Too many scars embedded in the landscape to pretend it was ever normal. Guards patrol walls that no longer need patrolling. Counts are conducted for populations that pose no real threat simply because procedures demand it. The island's terror reputation outlives the population. Fear has inertia. Norfolk Island in 1854 isn't particularly dangerous, but the idea of Norfolk Island, the stories that have circulated through the convict system for 3 decades, that doesn't dissipate just because the actual conditions have changed. Men arrive at the mainland from Norfolk and carry the reputation with them. They tell stories, they show scars. They describe the crank mill, the floggings, the executions, the cooking pot uprising, and those stories propagate. They become legend. The real Norfolk Island and the mythical Norfolk Island start to separate, and the mythical version becomes more powerful than the reality, which means that even after closure, Norfolk will continue to function as a threat, as a cautionary tale, as the place that proves what happens when you give empire the authority to design punishment without limits. The final shipments are scheduled, spring 1855. The last transfers will move the remaining prisoners to facilities in New South Wales or Tasmania. The administrative machinery, ship manifests, prisoner records, transfer authorizations, grinds through its final iteration, May 1855. The last Norfolk Island convicts are removed. The evacuation is procedural, names checked against lists, prisoners loaded into boats, boats to ships, ships to the mainland. Each man becomes inventory one final time, counted and logged and transported with the same attention to detail that brought them here. Final day logistics are specific. Keys are counted, every lock is accounted for, stores are sealed, what's valuable is shipped back, what's worthless is left to rot. Tools are locked in the blacksmith shop, in the workshop buildings. Administrative records are packed in crates. The paperwork of 30 years of brutality ready to be filed in archives where historians will eventually find it. Buildings are reclassified from active containment facility to abandoned asset. The change in status is bureaucratic, but the implications are total. The fortress remains standing. The walls still surround the compound. The barracks could still house prisoners. But the purpose is gone. It's a gun left on a table after the war ends. Dangerous only in potential, waiting for someone to pick it up or rust it into safety. The last ship departs. The last prisoner is transferred. The penal station ends, not with violence, not with uprising or escape or dramatic collapse, with paperwork, with manifests, with the quiet administrative process of shutting down an experiment that failed. Empty institutions don't become peaceful. They become haunted, not by ghosts but by physics. Wind through corridors, rain through rafters where the roof has finally failed, weeds through mortar joints, the sounds that structures make when human activity stops and entropy takes over. The buildings at Kingston stand empty for a time, not long. The island won't stay abandoned. Geography doesn't allow it. 14 square miles of arable land in the South Pacific. Someone will want it. Someone will come. But for a period, maybe months, maybe a year, Norfolk Island exists in a strange liminal state. The fortress without prisoners, the machine without power, the ruins in waiting. And in that silence, in those empty barracks and overgrown yards, you can almost hear what the island was. The accumulated weight of suffering that soaked into stone, the flogging counts that were recorded in ledgers, the 13 graves from the 1834 uprising, the 12 bodies in Murderer's Mound, the 136,000 lashes documented across decades. The island doesn't forget. The structures don't forgive. They just stand. Witnesses made of limestone and timber and iron, holding the shape of what happened here until weather and time reduced them to rubble. But even then, even as ruins, they'll be readable. Because that's Norfolk Island's final curse. The brutality is too complete to be erased, too well documented, too thoroughly built into the landscape. The site's afterlife begins. Later occupants arrive. The descendants of bounty mutineers from Pitcairn Island will be resettled here in 1856. They'll reuse the buildings, live in structures designed as barracks, convert punishment architecture into domestic space. The penal layer becomes the dominant visible ruin field at Kingston. Later construction happens? Yes. But what survives most completely, what tourists will eventually walk through, what UNESCO will designate as heritage, that's the machinery of the penal colony. Government House, the barracks compounds, the commissariat store where supplies were distributed under guard, the cemetery where consequences were recorded in stone, the bridges, the mills. Cava, Kingston, and Arthur's Vale. Historic area preserves these structures, not as celebration, as evidence. Because the archaeological record at Norfolk Island is a readable diagram of how an institution thought. The placement of buildings reveals hierarchy. The thickness of walls reveals fear. The density of barracks reveals the economics of confinement. The location of the cemetery reveals the bureaucracy of death. You can walk through Kingston today and read the settlement like a text. The commandant's house elevated, the prisoners' barracks in the low ground, the workshops positioned where labor could be observed, the landing pier and seawall showing where the island interfaced with the supply chain that sustained it. Every structural choice was a decision about control, about visibility, about making power legible in stone so that everyone, prisoner, guard, visitor, understood the hierarchy instantly and instinctively. And here's the ultimate dystopian turn. Norfolk Island's brutality becomes a tour route. The cemetery becomes an archive you can walk through, reading headstones that document uprising and execution and the casual mortality of a place where death was operational routine. Tourists photograph the ruins, stand in the barracks. Imagine what it was like. The site is heritage now, protected, maintained, interpreted through plaques and guided tours and educational materials that try to convey the scope of what happened here without making it entertaining. It's a difficult balance. How do you present horror without sanitizing it? How do you preserve evidence of systematic cruelty without converting suffering into spectacle? Norfolk Island forces that question because the ruins are beautiful. The stone has weathered into texture. The walls frame views of the ocean. The cemetery is peaceful. Grass maintained, headstones cleaned, paths clear. The aesthetic overlay of preservation can make you forget momentarily what the place was designed to do. But then you read the flogging numbers. 136,440 lashes. You do the math. You realize that's not an abstraction. That's skin broken, blood spilled, bodies scarred, pain inflicted according to schedule across decades, and the cynical verdict forms itself. Norfolk Island didn't fail because it was cruel. Norfolk Island was cruel because that was the design. The brutality wasn't a bug in the system. It was the core feature, the entire point. The island was always meant to be unendurable. That's why it was chosen. That's why it was maintained at extraordinary cost across decades, despite being logistically unstable and financially questionable. Because the British Empire needed a place worse than transportation, a threat beyond the standard mechanisms of punishment, a shadow jurisdiction where normal rules didn't apply and normal mercy didn't exist, and they built it, not in metaphor, actually built it, in stone and iron and routine violence quantified in ledgers. The system worked exactly as designed until it didn't. Until the violence required to maintain deterrence exceeded the violence authorities were willing to deploy or defend. Until the cost, financial, political, moral, became unsustainable even for an empire comfortable with extraordinary brutality. The lesson of Norfolk Island isn't that institutions are naturally cruel. It's that institutions become what they're designed to be. And when you design a system around fear, when you make suffering the primary operational tool, you create machinery that requires escalation, because fear is a resource that depletes. What terrifies in year 1 becomes tolerable by year 10, which means you need more fear, harsher punishment, higher walls, more frequent executions. The system has to keep producing novelty and brutality just to maintain baseline deterrence, until eventually you hit the limit, the point where even the architects of the system look at what they've created and recognize that the machine has exceeded its mandate, that the experiment has produced data no one wants to acknowledge. Norfolk Island hit that limit. The cooking pot uprising and its aftermath forced a reckoning. Not because 12 executions were unprecedented, executions had happened before, but because the cycle was becoming visible. Brutality producing resistance, producing brutality, producing resistance, an engine of violence that fed itself. And the system, confronted with its own logic laid bare, chose closure over reform. Chose to shut down the experiment rather than admit the experiment's fundamental design was the problem. The ruins remain. The cemetery remains. The historical record remains. And what they testify to is this: any system built on fear eventually needs more fear than it can safely contain. Norfolk Island proved it. Built the proof in limestone and flogging records and unmarked graves. Left the evidence standing for anyone willing to look and read and understand what happens when institutions are given unlimited authority to punish and no obligation to show mercy. The wind still blows across those 14 square miles. The waves still argue with the reef. The stone walls still stand, weathering slowly under salt air, holding the shape of what was decided here. And the island remembers, even if we choose to forget.